Welcome to the Wayne Public Library's virtual author chat. My guest today is Priyanka Taslim. Priyanka is a writer, educator, and lifelong New Jersey resident. Having grown up in the bustling Bangladeshi diaspora community, surrounded by her mother's entire clan and many aunties of no relation, her writing often features families, communities, and all the drama therein. Priyanka tells all kinds of stories about Bangladeshi characters. Her writing usually stars spunky Bengali heroines finding their place in the world, and a little swoony romance too. The Love Match, out now from Salam Reads, an imprint of Simon & Schuster, is her debut YA novel and has been praised in mediums such as Teen Vogue, USA Today, Pop Culture List, and more. It was a Junior Library Guild Gold Standard selection and one of Amazon's best young adult novels of January 2023. Her adult debut, From Mumbai with Love, will be published by St. Martin's Griffin in 2024, and she has future novels in the works with both publishers. Welcome, Priyanka. Please tell us a little more about yourself and your novel, The Love Match.
Thank you so much for having me. So my name is Priyanka. I was born and raised in Paterson. I don't live there anymore, but I was born and raised in Paterson, New Jersey, not too far away from the Wayne Public Library. And I actually taught there for quite a while as well. I was an English teacher and I still am an English teacher, just in a different medium. And so the Love Match is actually set in Paterson. I think it's one of the first books or one of the more recent books to be set in Paterson that really focuses on things like Paterson's Great Falls and its history, its various diaspora populations, but especially the Bangladeshi community there. So The Love Match is a young adult romantic comedy that follows 18-year-old Zara Khan, who has just graduated from high school. 2 years ago, her father passed away, and since then, her family has really been struggling financially because he was the breadwinner. Now her mom has to work full time. She works full time at a local tea shop. And because of this situation, she's actually deferred her acceptance to her dream college, Columbia University, to work full time and help her family for a little while longer. But because her mom feels bad that she has to do that, she decides to take a more traditional approach and set Zara up with the son of a wealthy local family because she thinks, oh, if she's married, if she has a rich husband, if he's taking care of her, then she can do whatever she wants. But of course, Zara's not interested in this. She's a modern Bangladeshi American young woman, and neither is the boy that her mom sets her up with, whose name is Haroon. So the two of them then devise a scheme to kind of turn things around on their parents by pretending to date each other, by pretending to give this relationship a chance, even as they sabotage it from within. And at the same time, she's falling for this new boy who has started working at the tea shop with her named Naeem. And he's very different from anyone that she knows. He's kind of takes her away from this like responsible immigrant daughter mindset that she has and makes her realize there's more to the world. So there is a love triangle, there's fake dating, and she starts to realize that maybe there's more to Haroon than meets the eye once they start scheming together.
Wonderful. Sounds like a great romantic comedy, even though it's a little younger audience, but it's wonderful. It sounds like a great story. So you kind of gave us an overview, but if you were to like try to summarize the story with what would you say your book is about? Like just a summary of it, but without really, well, no, without summarizing it. Sorry, what you say is about.
So The Love Match has a lot of themes. It is a romantic comedy, but it has a lot of themes, and I wanted it to feel very escapist while still being grounded in the realities of what a teenager in Paterson might experience. Because as I mentioned, I taught there for a really long time. And so I would have students who had to kind of be a third parent to their younger siblings, who had a lot of responsibilities, who had to work and go to school at the same time. And I didn't really see a lot of romantic comedies, which are kind of in this utopian alternative universe most of the time, touch on those things. So I would say that it has those themes of struggles that real teenagers deal with in communities like Paterson, while still having that very escapist romantic comedy straight out of a movie feeling of all the stuff that might not necessarily happen in real life.
it did sound like a movie plot. So it's it definitely got that vibe going there with what you described. Um, are any of your characters based on anyone you know?
So I would say I put a little bit of myself in both Zara and Haroon. Like Zara, I'm the oldest daughter in my family. And so I had a lot of responsibilities. I was the first person in my family to go to college in the US. My parents worked really hard to make that happen. Since I'm the oldest, I had a lot of responsibility fall on me. I was my parents' translator. I was a third parent. I had to be responsible for my siblings. I still am. They come to me for advice. And so I'd say most of me probably went into her. But then Haroon he's a Mr. Darcy type. He's very stoic and he keeps a lot inside. But inside, there's a lot of turmoil, and he's this very angsty teenage boy. And I think I was an angsty teenager. So there's a bit of me there too, literally anxious sometimes. So there's me in there too. And then I would say the rest of the characters are just a hodgepodge of various people I've met throughout my life. Definitely based, maybe not on specific people that I know, but I based the aunties and their closeness with each other. They're very small town mentality, even though they're living in a city. To the aunties that I know of, my mom's friends and the community that I grew up in Paterson, that was very, very close, which came with problems sometimes, in addition to still being fun and interesting.
Okay. What was the best or worst piece of advice you received while writing your novel?
I think the best piece of advice was to write for myself, write as if am my first audience. Because I think that when you're an author, there's a lot of things that go on in your head of wondering, is this going to be marketable? Is this commercial? Will other people like it? And of course, that's important to know, and at least important to acknowledge that if you're okay with those things not being true, what impact that might have on your writing. But I really wrote this book for the teenager that I was, because I never really had books like this growing up with characters like me as main characters. So I wrote it for myself, and I think that that is important for authors to do. If you enjoy a book, hopefully that means that if you're able to reread it a million times, which you'll have to do as an author, that usually means that other people will hopefully find some enjoyment and resonate with it as well.
Okay. And do you have a favorite line from the book?
There is a line where Zara mentions, and I think it's a love story, but I would say it's almost more of a love story between her and her mother and their complicated relationship with each other, and kind of getting back to a closeness with each other that they lost when their relationship changed because her father passed away. So there is a line where she mentions that she guards her dreams close, like it's a dandelion, because she doesn't want her mother to blow those wishes away. And she feels like if she exposes that dandelion to her mom, then that's what will happen. So I think that's one of my favorite lines in the book. It happens pretty early on. And as their relationship evolves, I hope that it gives hope to other kids who kind of feel, especially when you're a teenager, you kind of feel like nobody in the world understands me. My parents definitely don't understand me. And mothers and daughters have that, especially when they, like now me and my mom are best friends. We're very close. But as a teenager, I always felt like, oh, I feel like she's picking on me too much and she's so nitpicky and critical. And it takes understanding of each other, I think, that hopefully arises throughout the book and hopefully happens for people in real life too.
Is there one subject that you think you would never do as a writer? Would you never cover in your stories as a writer?
So when I was growing up, the majority of the books that featured South Asian characters or Muslim characters tended to be what we call issue books, which are about things that I think are important, like Islamophobia. We see ripples of Islamophobia even now. I grew up post 9/11. I was a kid when 9/11 happened. And so I definitely got to witness a lot of the ramifications of that within our larger cultural society and how people were treated. And so I think those books are very important for teaching empathy, but I struggle to write those kinds of books. When I was a kid, I wouldn't read books like that. Other people would pick them up, and I would hope that they would learn from them and get more empathy from them. But I was drawn to romance novels and I was drawn to fantasy novels because they were escapist for me. It was already my reality. I didn't need to read about people experiencing Islamophobia or bigotry. I wanted to read things that were fun. And so I think that that has stayed true when it comes to my writing, that I really want to tell these stories and let characters like my protagonists are be main characters in stories that are escapist, that are romantic, that are fantastical, so that kids who read them or even adults who read them pick them up and think, I can be a main character like that. I deserve to have stories like this too that are about joy and not just about my struggles. And I think that that can be revolutionary in its own way, because sometimes it feels like everything is kind of falling on you at once and doesn't want you to be happy. So if you get to see stories where characters get to be happy and get to be fall in love and go on a quest or whatever might be the case, I think that's important too.
Absolutely. It's very important. It can't always be hardship. It has to be like, hey, we're young, we want fun too.
Yeah,
So it's
absolutely.
great. Um, and what I kind of mentioned it in the intro, but what are you currently working on, or what's about, what's coming out later this year?
Well, it did actually get bumped to 2024, so I think I have to update my bio. I may have forgotten to do
Okay.
that on my website, but it got bumped to 2025. But I have my adult debut novel, which is called From Mumbai with Love, and it has some thematic similarities to The Love Match while also being very, very different. It's about a young woman who loses her mom. And her mom has been the only constant in her life. Her mom immigrated to America when she was pregnant with her, and it's just been the two of them. So after she loses her mom, she takes a DNA test just to kind of find out, is there anyone else out there for me, or am I now alone? And when she takes this DNA test, it connects her to her father's side of the family, who she's never really known, who her mom has always kind of kept secret from her. And she learns that her father is actually very, very wealthy. He has this whole other family. She has a half sister who's getting married, and she's invited to this wedding. That's the first time she's going to meet this whole family. And he is about to step down from his role as chairman for this very big company, and he's looking for an heir to take it over. So it's got a lot of threads. That's probably partially why it got bumped, because I had to make sure all the threads were working in the book. But I also thought it's really fun to kind of think about. It's not my life, so to kind of push this chaos onto a character of having to figure out all of these different things that are going on.
Um, for that book, did you have to do a lot of research, or is this like knowledge that you had from your experiences, your family, friends, anyone?
So there are definitely themes that I personally connect to. I feel like a lot of people who grow up as like third culture kids, who kind of feel like they're torn between two worlds. I feel like they'll relate to that because it's something that I relate to as well, where I'm Bangladeshi, but I was born and raised in the US. And so I don't feel like I could be 100% Bangladeshi, but then people don't see me as 100% American either, because there's always that other tie. And it's something that I'm proud of in both capacities, but also have to kind of figure out how to navigate. So I think that is relatable to me and would hopefully be relatable to a lot of other people. But I definitely had to do a lot of research on what it means to be, for example, a billionaire, because that's obviously not a life that I live. So for the first time in my life, I had to go on websites and search, instead of from lowest to highest, from highest to lowest when buying something, to kind of figure out, well, what would somebody who has a lot of money to splurge on this thing spend on it, rather than necessarily being in my range of budget. And it's also set in Mumbai, so I had to do a lot of research about the setting. And I want to, because she's traveling from New York to Mumbai to visit her family. And I wanted it to be written in a way where it's very respectful of the people there, while still kind of touching on having that sense of escapism, but still touching on things like class issues, because there's a very big delineation of the upper class who live there, and then the very, very poor. So that's something that I wanted to explore as respectfully as I possibly could as well. So yeah, I hope, just like with the love match, it has a good balance of these things that are real issues while still feeling escapist and romantic and fun.
Okay. Just to go back, I know I mentioned in the bio that it was 2024. You just said it was 2025. Tying up all those things. So can I ask, like, how do they go about making that decision, like to delay it, or how did that work out? Like, just for my own
So
personal interest.
So a lot of it was my fault, in the sense that so when I worked on the love match, the majority of the work for the love match happened during the pandemic early on. It sold in October of 2020. So I'd been working on it. Basically, I started right around the pandemic, when the pandemic started. And so that was my first time teaching from home. And it kind of opened up a new world for me. It was very difficult to figure out at first, but it also opened up new opportunities for me, where I found myself with reserves of energy that I didn't have, coming home as a teacher and then focusing on my writing. And then what happened is, I got lucky in that the love match was a 2-book deal. So there's a second book coming out also probably in 2025. That's not part of the same series, but is another young adult romance. And then I happened to sell this adult book as well. And so I was very, very excited when that happened. And then I went back to the classroom, and I loved being with my students, but I was very, very stressed out from all of the changes that took place post-pandemic. I taught high school, and all of a sudden, we had not just the ninth graders who are new to the building, but the 10th graders who had never been in high school before, and the 11th graders who had only been there for part of the year before they transitioned to being online. And so it changed a lot of expectations. There were behavioral struggles. These are things that affected everyone around the world. And a lot of pressure fell on the teachers as administration struggled to kind of figure out how to deal with it. And then all of a sudden, I had to worry about getting the love match ready for release and these back to back to back deadlines for these 2 books simultaneously. So the thing that I thought was lucky and wonderful, that I had sold multiple books, suddenly ended up being like this albatross around my neck that I was really struggling with. And so ultimately, it did fall on me a lot, in the sense that I just wanted the books to be good books. And I wasn't sure if I could do that if I was constantly exhausted and juggling everything. And then part of it too is, this is probably also because I was tired all the time, but with some of my early revisions for the book, I talked to my editor about it, and she would suggest, I think we can do a little bit more with this book. I think we can do more with this book. And so those revisions take time. And so that's ultimately what ended up moving the book, because there's a lot of stuff that has to happen before a book releases. And those things still needed to happen. So ultimately that was why. It's tough for me, because as a teacher, I'm just like, this is my deadline. I have to meet my deadline. I have to do my tasks. And then as an author, it's like, yes, I can meet my deadline, and I should meet my deadline. I shouldn't avoid it. But at the same time, this is a book that's going to exist in the world and have my name on it. And I don't want it to be a terrible book. So it took a lot of balancing of those thoughts to kind of get it where it needed to be.
Okay, thank you for letting me know. I mean, as a librarian, we see like, oh, this book is coming out, and then it's not, and you're like, what happened? So thank you. I've always wondered. I'm sure there's different reasons, but I mean, that's what. So, um, so I want to know if you hear from your readers, the ones that have read the Love Match, what kind of things do they say to you?
So I have had the pleasure of seeing, getting to communicate with a lot of different readers. My favorite thing ever is when I get an email from like a 12-year-old or 13, 14-year-old girl who says that it was their favorite book ever. And I just love that. I feel like that I'll be walking on air for another month after I get an email like that. I've met with a lot of South Asian girls who read the book and said they really felt seen by it, and they loved it. And so that kind of feedback always means a lot to me as well. I've also talked to adults who are like, yeah, you really like buckled down. My own experiences of family members being very nosy and trying to matchmake and all of that. So that's always nice as well. Um, I try to ignore the negative feedback as much as possible. And I will say people are polite enough not to come and tell me to my face if there is something that they don't like, because at that point it's like, well, the book is out now. What can I do?
Yeah, that I understand. That I understand. Um, it's great that you get those wonderful from like the young women who tell you these great things about the story, which seeing yourself on the page is a wonderful thing. You can't beat that. And it I would hope you would always hope that it opens the door to more authors thinking, or more people thinking, I can be an author. I can write this book that would be about me and my experiences too. So I tend to switch gears, not just the books, but also your writing experience. Over the years, how do you think you've developed as a writer?
So I went to Montclair State University, not too far away from Wayne, and I actually minored in creative writing. At that point in time, I already knew that I wanted to be a teacher, and also I had this very sensible immigrant mentality, which is kind of within the love match as well, where she wants to be a writer, but she's because her family's already financially struggling, she kind of always has in the back of her mind this voice of her mom saying, well, is this a good, wise option to pursue as a career? Or should you choose something that you know you're going to get a regular paycheck for? So that was kind of my mentality as well with becoming a teacher, where I knew that I wanted to do it, but also I had that voice in the back of my mind of my parents saying, well, teaching is a good, sensible career for you to have. Um, so I would say I went to Montclair. I decided to get my minor in creative writing rather than focusing my major on it. And that was an interesting experience because I'd always been drawn to novels, and I had to write short stories for the majority of my time there. And I think that that was a good experience to kind of figure out how to take a story and compact it for a short story and have those elements. I think it definitely made me a stronger writer. But I was focusing mainly on literary works when I was doing that. Whereas, as I mentioned earlier, I tend to be drawn to, I love reading fantasy novels and I'd want to write one someday too. But I also love romances, and those two things are not considered literary quite so much. But that's always what I was drawn to as a reader. So it kind of also impacted what I was drawn to as a writer. And then I became a teacher. And at least for the first couple of years, I was just tired all the time, just kind of in survival mode all the time. And so it took some time for me to really acclimate to the classroom. But what I would do then is I would read a lot of articles and things from Writer's Digest, and I would like sit with a highlighter and I would go through it and see what various authors suggest for how to strengthen character arcs and relationships and so on. And also, I was a fanfic author. And that I was a fanfic author from like 13 to 20 something. I don't write fanfic anymore, but I do read it sometimes still because it's like free and available. And I don't know, there's something about it where it's like a switch in your head where it's like, it's easy to consume for some reason, 130,000 word fanfic, and much more intimidating to pick up a book of the same length and get through it. I don't know why. But I think that helped me too, because from the time when I was like 13 on, obviously people don't always know how old you are on the internet. That's not great. But I would have a lot of people give me really positive reinforcement for those fanfics that I wrote. And so I think that kind of kept me going for a while, that instant gratification. Um, and then in 2016, I decided, okay, I've been a teacher for a little while. I'm going to now focus on actually trying to get an agent and trying to get published. So it took time, but I wrote a book, I queried it, I got an agent. It took time. I did a lot of revisions. I had to learn a lot about the process because I didn't know what querying even was. So I really had to learn a lot. I made a lot of mistakes, but ultimately I got an agent. And then it wasn't until, as I mentioned, 2020 when I sold the book, but it was a different book. Um, so yeah, it was a journey of ups and downs, and I try to keep making time for reading and critiquing things and reading about craft so that I can stay on top of it, because it is really easy when you have all these deadlines to kind of just get sucked into that vortex and not focus on anyone's work but your own. But I do think that the thing that makes you a stronger writer is just constantly reading as much as you can.
I've heard that from other authors, yes. Although when they're writing, they tend not to want to read in their genre. So, like, they'll read everything but their genre. Do you find yourself doing that? Like, you mentioned fantasy, and it's not something that you're writing. So, if you're reading it, it's reading, absolutely, but it's not in your genre.
Yes, definitely. Recently, this always happens when I'm really tired, where what I also do is I read a lot of, if you've heard of webtoons, which are like Korean comics. And so I read a lot of the fantasy ones of those too. Those tend to be things like, this is a really popular trope in them, where it's like somebody dies and then they're reborn in a novel that they've read that's a fantasy novel, and they have to kind of survive this world. So I find those very fun and kind of a different medium too, than what I'm working on. And so it's kind of a nice break, where technically I am still reading, I'm absorbing a story, but it's a nice break away from that Word document or the typical page. And then times when I can't read, I personally think that there's a lot of value in different mediums of storytelling. So whether it's a show or a movie or even sometimes a video game, I've always been a big fan of Final Fantasy video games, which always have like convoluted plots, but it's been kind of fun to like take those apart and think about them. So yeah, I would say refill the well, however works for you. You don't always have to be reading craft books or literary books or whatever might be the case, as long as you are still constantly feeding that creative beast in your head that needs a story to keep going.
That is true. And that is good advice. Thank you. um, what would you say in your life do you consider it was a major influence on your writing?
So definitely my culture and my relationship to my culture is something that writing has made me closer to. So I was always a voracious reader. I was always in the school library or the public library and just always in a book. And I always wanted to see my name on a book, but there were rarely characters like me in those books. And so you mentioned earlier too about how it's important for kids to know, like, hey, I can do that too. If Priyanka writing and existing and being an author means that I can do that too. And that wasn't always something that I had available to me when I was a kid, because none of my favorite authors looked like me. And very rarely were there ever characters who were coded to be like me. So uh, I would say like that was always something that like made an impact. Um, can you repeat your question again? I'm sorry, I lost
No,
my train of
no,
thought
what
from
do you think?
rambling.
It's okay. What in your life do you consider was a major influence on your writing?
Okay, yeah. So as a kid, I grew up in Patterson and I didn't always like it here. I would watch things like Gilmore Girls and think, I'd love to live in Stars Hollow, or I'd love to live in like one of the small towns that I'm reading about, or in this like fantasy medieval world that I'm reading about. And it was only in college where I started to get because I had more distance. Even if it was like nearby, I went away to school, I met more people away from where I grew up. And that kind of then made me more interested in my culture and the things that I didn't know about my culture. And it made me do more research. And so around that time, I was writing. a lot of fantasy or inspired by culture and just thinking like, oh, that would be an interesting world. That's a little different from all the fantasies that I grew up reading, which were mainly inspired by European or Greek mythology or whatever might be the case. And I loved all of that. But it could be interesting to then focus on my own culture. And then I think that has definitely given me more pride and interest in my culture in general, and hoping to then make it so that young readers now don't have to feel that kind of same sense of alienation from their culture by knowing that they can be main characters. So I would say in both, if I write fantasy and if I write romances, whatever I write, that definitely plays a big impact. And then I think just the way that I grew up, I was very close with my family. Sometimes we were at each other's throats, but I was close with my family, and I grew up in this like really big community, and sometimes it was annoying and sometimes it was great. And I think those elements often feature in my work. I'll have readers tell me that my characters feel really fleshed out even when they're side characters. And I think that's just because I grew up with this big community, I'm always kind of thinking, well, okay, Zara is the main character, but what's going on with her friends? What is their conflict? What is their arc? Um, why are they the way that they are? So I think that that helps to flesh out my characters. And I'm also really interested in family dynamics. I just find them so fascinating. I feel like a lot of romance authors focus on the romance, which is great. But then because I grew up with this like close knit family, and it's kind of just culturally expected for people to be close to their family and communities, I have I love the complicated sibling dynamics in From Mumbai with Love, where she's kind of trying to get her footing from being an only child to suddenly being the oldest in this family that has existed without her. And this like complicated mother-daughter relationship and father-daughter relationship, I think that unfortunately, as therapists will agree, our parents and our upbringing affect who we are. And I think that that's really fun to explore in writing. So I would say those things really had an impact on me.
Okay. Um, so, um, going from there, the major influences on your writing, and it has your writing as your writing has evolved. Do you find that there are certain elements, your craft elements that you think I'm really good at, and others that you're like, ugh, not my favorite, but I have to do it because I have to get the book published? Which would you say?
Yeah, for sure. So as I mentioned, I think that my strength is with the characters, and it's just because I try not to put a character into a book that I don't find interesting in some way. If they are like that, then they're a very minor side character that where they're not impacting the story. But if, for example, I write a best friend for my protagonist. They're not just there to prop up the protagonist, they kind of have their own things going on that I think make them interesting characters. So I would say that that's probably one of my strengths with the characters. Um, as far as other things go with improving, I definitely think I can always get better at writing romances, just because I sometimes get so lost in those other elements that it's like I need my editor to then come in and say, well, let's flesh this out more. Let's build up this dynamic more. And I think it's been interesting writing in multiple spaces with multiple age range, just because it's different in those spaces. So for example, From Mumbai with Love is for older readers, and it is primarily a family drama. It is a women's fiction novel, so I wouldn't necessarily call it a romance, although I don't like the term women's fiction. Like, I feel like it's very alienating, and why is women's fiction have a specific thing? It should just be fiction. But anyway, I won't go on that tangent. But that's technically what it is. But it also has romances throughout it, and so the things that I got asked for with those romances are different than what I got asked for writing young adult romances, which are more innocent, first love for younger readers. So that's been something to figure out too, where my editor will say, well, can we spice this up more? And I'm like, well, okay, now it's time for me to figure out how to season on the page, because I know how to cook, but I've never spiced things up on the page before, having written this young adult romance before. So yeah, there's definitely, I feel like I'm always learning and growing and hopefully getting better at all of those things by keeping an open mind.
I agree with you with the women's fiction. They were trying out. I went to like a online thing for librarians, and they were calling it relationship fiction. So that was the other choice.
Yeah, I don't know if I like
Fiction
that
is
either, but
fiction. It's fiction. Um, so you mentioned how long it took you kind of to write your first book. On average, do you have like an average of like what you say, like it took me this long to write a book, or do you have a writing routine that you need to do X, Y, and Z to make sure you can sit down and write?
definitely. So when I'm at my best, where like nothing else is stressing me out. I don't have multiple deadlines because what I quickly realize is I'm someone who needs to hyper focus on a story. When I'm working on a story, I kind of live and breathe it. On my way to work, I would like play my playlist with the characters and just be thinking of them constantly. And that really helped me get into their voices, get into their worlds. And then when I had multiple deadlines, I had to constantly stop and refocus, and I wasn't good at that at all. So when I'm at my best and I can do that, I'd say it really only takes me a couple of months to write a book. At least that first draft. Obviously, it would then need to be revised, and who knows how long that takes. It depends on the book and the quality of that first draft. But I'd say anywhere from maybe like 2 to 6 months, because sometimes I do then have those other struggles of like I have to stop. There's another deadline, so then I have to pull away from this book, and then when I go back to it, it feels like I'm meeting with a friend who I haven't seen for a long time, and kind of back in that stage of, well, what's been going on with you in this time that we've been apart, which is not conducive to me as a writer. I really struggle with that. As far as my writing routine, I tend to be a night owl, and I feel like all my creative juices start flowing at night. And so I think it actually helps me. I have to find a balance for it. I had to find a balance for it, but it helps me to kind of have something during the day that hopefully doesn't like drain the life out of me, to the point where I can come home at night and reshift gears and then sit down and write. Um, and usually I'll have a cup of tea before that, even if it's too late for caffeine, and hopefully they'll like wake me up again. And what I usually do, they say you shouldn't revise while you're working on a first draft, but maybe it's because I'm forgetful, but I like to read at least a chapter or so of what I was already working on and then go from there, because I think it kind of resituates me. And then ideally, if my focus is in place, I can sit and like really get a goal done. But I try not to have a daily word count goal. Instead, what I tell myself is to kind of do my best to reach a point of closure, whether that's the end of a scene in a chapter or it's the end of a whole chapter, and just keep going. So I'm not like starting in the middle, where at least I can say, okay, I have this scene done. Maybe the chapter's not done, but I can reread this scene to reorient myself into this world before I keep going.
Okay. Um, and with your manuscript, when you completed the first one, how long between completing the first one and getting that call that says, we want to buy your book?
So the love match was a bit of a strange experience because it went on submission and was only on submission for, I believe it was a couple of weeks. And that's very, very rare. It's not what I was expecting at all. It was only on submission for a couple of weeks. And then we got our first email saying that an editor was interested, or a little bit before that, we got an email saying someone was reading and they would get back to us. And then we got our first email saying an editor was interested in having a call. And it did end up going to auction. So there were a couple of different editors, a few different editors who were interested in it. And I ended up having a video conference with each of them so that they could talk about what exactly appealed to them and what their vision for the book. But that was really fast, and it wasn't what I expected. And then from Mumbai with Love, it took longer, and that was also because periodically we sent it out to an editor exclusively, and then she gave a revision. for it, a revise and resubmit. And that took a little bit of time because I also had other things going on with the love match. And so then I did that revision ultimately. And then they said, okay, we're going to cast a wider net, even though like she gave the revision, but we're going to cast a wider net and kind of go from there. And that one also had a couple of offers. And so it was just a matter, but I guess it didn't have as many, so it wasn't as exciting. I had to take a day off for the love match to kind of meet with everyone. And I didn't have to do that for From Mumbai with Love, but I'd say it took maybe 6-ish months between all of the revisions and then going back out on submission with it. And then I've heard of cases where it takes much longer or much shorter for some people. So it really does vary. I don't know what would happen. I feel like you can't predict based on previous whatever happened with previous books what'll happen in the future with anything, with the amount of money that they'll pay, with who might be interested, with any of that. So you're always kind of going in blind every single time. That's just a mentality that I try to keep with it.
Well, hopefully now they have two. You have more than two. You have multi book contracts. So, what would you say is like the most surprising thing you learned in publishing your book?
So I feel like, and a lot of people probably have these misconceptions as well. Because if you asked me several years ago what I thought the process of publishing a book would look like, I thought it was like printing out a gigantic manuscript and mailing it to a publisher. I didn't know you need an agent or any of that. Um, and I feel like the landscape has changed. So I didn't realize how much work went into being an author. I thought it was like you write a book and then somebody else does all the marketing and all the work for you at that point, and you can kind of be a hermit. Like that was always my dream. I really wanted to be a hermit. I just wanted to like sit at home somewhere and write books and drink coffee and like not have to interact with the world. But that's really not the case anymore. There's a lot of author responsibilities and things on social media. And I would say you don't need a social media, like I don't think it makes a big difference. Like my random tweets are not selling thousands of copies of the book. But there's definitely a lot of things that I have to do that I didn't realize, that I would say is like the biggest, my biggest takeaway, that publishing landscape has changed and will probably keep changing, and more kind of falls on the author, for what to do.
Yes, that's the standard answer. I get the marketing, plus, yeah, it's not the same. It's not what big name authors like
Yeah.
mid, mid authors. Yeah, that's generally what they tell me. Um, so I have to ask: Are you a member of a writers group, or do you have critique partners that you work with?
Yes, and some of them are here today, so I really appreciate them being here. I have been friends with my critique partner group for a while now. They probably know how many years better than me because I forgot, but our anniversary is tomorrow, actually, coincidentally. And so this critique partner group started out on Twitter, where we would just like post threads of like, I'm going to write now for like an hour or two. Does anybody want to join me? And that's how we met. Just through there where other people would jump in and say, yeah, I want to write too. I'm going to join you. And then we would have little timers of like, we're going to write until it's 30, wherever you are, whatever your time zone, or we're going to write until we reach that 00, wherever you are. And then we got closer and closer, kind of migrated to a Twitter DM, and then from there to one of the various platforms of like where you can more easily chat with people and phone number exchanges. And we've met in person with we did a writing retreat, and we'll hopefully do some more in the future. And yeah, so I definitely think it can be hard to find those people, your people, and writing is such an isolating thing. But if you just keep an open mind and you kind of guard your heart a little bit because it is your work, your baby. But like once you find the right people, um, I don't tend to look for new critique partners really anymore because there's people that I know that I'm close with that I can rely on for that and who can rely on me for that. And yeah, but it does require putting yourself out there, which was hard for me as an introvert at first.
That is for most authors. Most authors being the introvert, wanting to be the hermit, sitting at home. Yes. Um, so, my, well, my second to last question is, what advice would you give a new author, new writer that's just starting out? What would you let them know that they should?
So I would say the main thing, because this is also something that I had to learn, even when I was writing fan fiction, I was not completing. I would start stories, and there are probably people still out there wondering, like, oh, wonder if that person's ever coming back. I wonder what happened to that person who never finished that fanfic that I really liked for 10 chapters before they disappeared off the face of the planet. Um, I was not a completionist and I was really struggling with that. And so I would say the main thing is that everyone experiences that hurdle of looking at that white page and kind of feeling like you're at the bottom of Everest and you're never going to get to the pinnacle. So you just have to finish the book, that first draft. I'd say that's the biggest thing because once you finish the first draft, as has always been the case with me, or most of the time been the case with me, there's like one NaNoWriMo novel that I made it to the 50,000 and then I was like, this is not great. I'm better off taking my time. But however much time it does take you, get that draft done, whether it's a zero draft, a first draft, whatever you want to call it. And then once that's done, you can revise because I feel like I hear from a lot of people who are in that place that where I was, where they were really excited about something in the beginning and then maybe they lose that excitement and then they just stop working on it. And I feel like it's hard to find that excitement again. I have to force myself now that I have these multiple contracts. As I mentioned, I'm very much of a focus on one book type of person. You can't always do that. So you kind of have to be prepared to do the work, get it done, and then sure, let it sit for a while. But I guarantee you're going to have more enthusiasm coming back to it because you already did that initial hard part. And revising is still difficult, but it's a different ball game. It's a little bit less intimidating than never finishing anything. I feel like once you've finished one book, you know, I did it before. Why can't I again? Whereas if you never reach that point, you're always going to be wondering, can I even do this? So just finish, no matter what it looks like.
Okay. And then I always leave a fun question, is what I call it, for the end. So, what do you always want to talk about in interviews but never get to?
Hmm. You've had a lot of great questions, but well, I talked a little bit about my next adult book, but my next young adult book has been kind of under wraps, so so nobody's asked about that yet. So I could talk about that a little bit. It's still untitled. Well, I have a title, but I'm not 100% sure if it's going to be the title. But this one is a young adult rom-com as well. And it's been really fun for me to write because, as I mentioned, I am the oldest sister, and I have this very much. I feel like it doesn't even. I call it an immigrant family mentality, and I feel like it is like overemphasized with daughters in immigrant families, but it is in general. Like women are socialized when you're the oldest daughter to take on these responsibilities that wouldn't necessarily be the same thing if you're a son. And so I've always been the oldest daughter, and Zara is the oldest daughter. And my main character in From Mumbai with Love is figuring out how to go from an only child, which is also not my experience, to the oldest daughter and what comes from that. So it was really fun for me to be able to write this next book where the main character is a youngest daughter and she's the baby of the family, and so she has this different dynamic that's kind of inspired by my little sister and her dynamic with our parents, where she is the baby of the family and she's a little bit spoiled, and she hasn't had to have these same burdens that come with being the oldest. And then how does that like inform her as a character? So it's been kind of fun to write this character who is more flighty and irresponsible, and she's a little boy crazy, and it's okay. When you're a young girl and you're kind of figuring out the world, that's okay too. So, in this book, she's like very determined, like this is gonna be her summer of love. This is gonna, or like her summer of like finally getting to kiss a boy and hold hands with a boy and have a boyfriend. And her dad is very against that. And then she gets punished, and so she thinks her summer is ruined. But then her sister comes and announces that she's fallen in love. Her very responsible older sister, who is always like, no, I'm gonna accomplish my dreams before I ever consider marriage, comes and says, well, I've actually fallen in love and I want to get married, and then we're having this wedding over the summer. And so she's like pulled into this like exciting wedding, but then she also bumps heads with someone that she meets there. And yeah, so it's been kind of fun to get into that voice and that character because it's not as close to who I am as a person.
Um, this has been really fun. I enjoyed talking to you. Um,
So thank you so much for having me.
but I do want to thank you, Priyanka, so much for joining us this evening and for telling us a little bit about your story, about the love match, and about what you have in the pipeline coming out next year, maybe next year, and then going forward. Sounds like a lot of fun. And again, thank you so much for sharing a little bit about yourself and about your books.
Of course, thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful.